Each individual should have the freest possible scope for the development of his faculties and his personality. In order to have this scope, he must have freedom from violence against himself. Violence can only repress and destroy human growth and endeavor, and neither can reason and creativity function under an atmosphere of coercion. If each person has equal defense against violence, this equality before the law will permit him to maximize his potentials. Welcome to Keith Knight. Don't tread on anyone. Today we have Sean Leal to discuss a book he has written regarding morality. I don't want to give away the title just yet because it's terrific. Sean, thank you for coming on Keith Knight. Don't tread on anyone.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So when discussing morality, a few things come to mind that we can sort of all agree on without there being, a fight in the cafeteria at work about anything. And it's like, okay, the things we know are wrong: slavery, rape, murder, kidnapping, theft, genocide. What is it about these acts that you think is immoral?
Well, yeah, that's the big question. And I actually was listening to your show with Mark Passio and Larkin Rose recently, and that question was floated, and it's a challenging one. So I took a step back and I started thinking, okay, so who determines this morality? Where is its source? And when looking at a particular act, I realized that we all know that the person who takes an action can't be the judge of the morality of that action, because then the classic example is Mao Zedong or something can judge his own actions to be moral. External observers can't judge it either because they're not affected by the action at all. So by logical deduction, only the receiver, the person who is being affected by that action, is the one who is judging that action to be moral or immoral. And ultimately, it comes down to consent. If the person who is being acted against is consenting to the action, then the action is perfectly moral. If they are not consenting to the action, then the action is immoral. And thus was where I made the connection between consent and morality. And so that's why I titled the book Consent is Morality.
Now, just so we're on the same page, first of all, I love how at the beginning of the book you get definitions, so we're on the right page.
Mm-hmm.
So many philosophy books could either just not have been written or have saved 300 pages by just making sure we're talking about the same thing.
Right.
How would you define consent?
Okay, so consent is the affirmative decision or expression of accepting an action. We can get into the depths of consent itself, but that's really the bottom line is if a person voluntarily, without external coercion, allows another person to take an action or does an action to themselves, then by definition they consent to it. But it's really about the voluntary acceptance of, and what's also very important is the expression of it. It must be explicit, and it must be given so that the other party that's taking the action actually has the consent.
Do you think there are times where there is implicit consent? For example, if I let someone in my house, well, they can get some water from the fridge. They can sit on the couch. Maybe they can have, they can use my pen and the ink in there, but they can't take my card. Do you think there is some implied consent in the action for the sake of, it would take so much time and effort and energy to get consent for every single thing that sometimes we do go on implied?
I think that there's certainly cultural aspects to that. I argue in the book that technically, if you want to get down to splitting hairs, there's no actual implied consent. I think the good example is if you fall unconscious and medical people start to try to help you, or if a young teenager attempts suicide or something, then people try to save that person. There's some people say that there's an implied consent. In fact, I argue that the medical personnel in that example are violating the person's consent. Now, maybe in our society, we essentially are looking the other way to the violation of that consent. As you know, and a lot of folks in our space, a lot of people are looking the other way about a lot of violations of consent in society. So that's not entirely unheard of. But technically, if you want to get down to brass tacks, I would argue that those are violations of consent.
And do you think that they can be justified in some instances? For example, is it okay for me to go and invade anyone's house whenever I want to? Well, no, that's a blatant violation of consent. Well, what if Jack and Jill get married and Jack takes out an insurance policy for $2 million? Jill goes missing the next day. We see Jack carrying a heavy Persian rug out of his house at 2 a.m. Well, and he refuses to come down to the courthouse. Well, maybe then I can initiate aggression and forcefully enter the house. Or if someone's choking, can I put my body up against theirs and thrust really hard? I mean, to stop them from choking? Is it ever okay to violate the consent of a person?
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, in the first example, that person took out the insurance has already committed the aggression, right? So the actions would be an attempt to punish those aggressions. In the choking example, I think in those examples, it's pretty clear that the person who was saved or the person who was helped would turn around and say, "Thank you. Yes, I retroactively consented to your action," or even by the choking example, a lot of people will sign to themselves and point to themselves and somehow indicate that they need help. Obviously, if they're unconscious, they can't. But I think I think the I did say early on, I did make it clear early on in the book that the world is not perfect. Humans live in the meat space, as they say, and it's very squishy, and there are definitely exceptions and situations where that would be certainly controversial or it may appear to poke holes in the philosophy, but and I do address that. I do address that early on to make sure that the folks know that the ideology is consistent. Just because that there are little weird examples that might fall outside of it doesn't mean that the entire philosophy is damaged.
And that is so important to get into because, I mean, yes, literally anything can be justified in extreme examples. Like anyone who is openly against slavery, well, is it okay to enslave someone for 3 seconds to save the entire human race from cancer, AIDS, COVID, and another speech from Bernie Sanders? Yes, absolutely. Those things are so terrible that if just some small microscopic thing can be have such a different challenge, different change to human events, well, in some cases it would be okay. All of that is a clear distraction or stalling tactic used to get away from the major examples. So, my question to you is what are some major reasons we should value consent, and aren't we already doing that?
Well, clearly we're not. As I mentioned before, there's a large number of acts that are taken every single day that violate consent. My argument in the book, and the book is kind of laid out in three sections. The first is kind of to describe the philosophy from beginning to end. The second is to give some of these examples that we've been talking about, a little bit more real worldy examples. And then the third is to talk about what happens in a world where consent is not being followed. And one example I talk about is with children. If I can consent for someone else, what would happen if you're not able to withhold your consent? What kinds of things that could happen in society? I could take all of your property. I could enslave you. I can take your children. I mean, if humans don't have the ability to withhold consent, I argue that society would not last. actually. Yeah, I don't think it would stay cohesive in any sense for very long at all. So at the very end of the book, I talk about why, what kind of actions that are violating consent and how to recognize them, and what do we need to do to build a more consensual society.
Sure. As far as just getting any philosophy consistently applied, if you say, no, screw this, I don't care about consent or who has the right to own what, that can't even be consistently applied, because if I have the right to steal your headphones, well, that implies I have the right to own and possess them, and then someone should steal them from me because theft is right. But they can't rightfully take it and own it and exclude because theft is okay and I can violate their consent. The only consistent methodology to any philosophical discussion here would be something that talks about both consent and ownership. So I'm curious, how do you determine who owns what and who is the aggressor in any given situation?
Sure. From the very beginning, I start very, very basically. I mean, I even start at I think, therefore I am. I go right to the root of humanity and talk about ownership, and I'm very clear about how a person, because they own themselves, and I make sure that I set that baseline about why people own themselves. I discuss the fact that when you own yourself, you own your time. So a lot of folks, I'm sure, who are, a lot of your viewers, a lot of your listeners already know this, but for those who are new to it, because you own your life, you own your time, that's something that, because it's yours, you may freely trade it for something else. And that something else, that property, is now as much a part of you as that time was that you traded for it. Those two things are equivalent. Which is why if anyone steals something from you, if someone steals a car from you, they are essentially enslaving you for the time that you spent to produce the resources to make that car. So it's when you look at it from that angle, it's very clear about who owns what. It's who voluntarily and peacefully traded what they own for something else in agreement to other people. I think that's yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Now, would you agree with me that voluntary consent can trump labor value or labor effort? For example, if I go to a place and I work for 10 hours a day, 5 days a week for a year, and I build a bunch of houses, I don't own the houses and I don't even have the right to be compensated if I chose to sign up for a charity to help build houses for people. So, in that sense, could I do a ton of labor and rightly not be compensated because I voluntarily agreed? And therefore, again, we're back at consent being the root of morality instead of time and effort equaling my right to something.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that makes perfect sense. If a person, I think with situations like that, you have to think about it from a little bit of higher level, right? So think about the person who, okay, so a worker volunteers his or her time to build houses. The person, now the organization that they're volunteering to, gets all of the labor, builds the houses, and either donates them or sells them to another person. And then that other person now is very grateful they have the house. But if the laborer walks in and says, "Hey, this is mine, I built it," it's they're going against their original agreement. Certainly there's ethical problems there, and which I do separate out in the book, the difference between ethics and morality. But they've the property exists. They gave their time freely, voluntarily, just as you would give money, or any other property. And the other person who's now received it now, even though they received it freely, it is theirs because that property was and that time was given voluntarily at the time, and it's gone. That's once you give something away and you've agreed to giving it away, and then I suppose you could get a situation where somebody decides, does that. If someone does that, if someone gives away property and says, "No, I want that back," they're not going to get a very good reputation. So I think even in the situation where where someone could argue that they could retrieve that property back, it's not going to come without consequences. They're going to be seen as somebody who does that, and the trust is going to be gone. So there's a lot to that possibility.
Now, one major thing is you can always, come up. It's always interesting to come up with examples. Is it okay to steal, 1 penny to save the entire planet from destruction? Yes. Well, in some of these cases, I've got you in sort of a bit of a conundrum. Therefore, the existence of a state is legitimate. That is the biggest non sequitur you can imagine. It's the equivalent of saying, there's a lot of ambiguity in our dealings. Therefore, Amazon has the right to coercively rule us, make executive orders we have to follow. It's like, no, because all of the shortcomings that we face apply tenfold to this group of people called the state, or any other group of people, saying that consent and morality applies to them differently. You have a great question that you pose to the reader. You say, should the morality of a particular action, if that action is right or wrong, be judged using the same method for everyone who does it, regardless of their job or intent? Why is that question important?
It really does go right to the question about government. I mean, I do it kind of subversively, because the target audience, when I was first coming up with the idea of this book, is that kind of young person, idealistic person, maybe who considers themselves on the left, who really, maybe grew up in the Me Too movement as it was getting big, and really did fundamentally understand that consent is primary. And I think a lot of people do believe deep down that consent is key. It's the thing that's really the biggest thing to be cognizant of. So starting from that, I started putting those kinds of little seeds in the beginning of the book, and that question in particular was to get to the point later on where, yes, just because somebody has a blue uniform and a shiny badge, they're just a human being just like the rest of us, and they don't have any special powers. You can't. I can go through this in the book, is you can't grant powers that you don't first possess. So I make sure I started very simply, and so that it supports the arguments that I make later on.
It's so important because people can just apply that consistently in any case. If people will often say, well, this is my job, or even, non-police officers, non-members of the military will say, well, that's just their job and that's just what they're doing, as if getting paid, like doing the thing is bad. But if someone's paying you to do it, now it's okay. I mean, the example I use is, yes, I go around assaulting women, but I only do it when their ex-boyfriends hire me to do it. And so I'm just doing my job. And now it's totally different, and morality doesn't count. Of course not. The other thing you said about the ability to transfer things you don't have. This is vital when it comes to consent. Because if you say, well, the people consent to something like regulation or taxation, well, if the citizens, if I just don't have the right to go around issuing taxes to people, or going around regulating people or conscripting them, how can I delegate that to a group of individuals who, if I don't have X, how can I transfer X to someone else? And I can't take it back. Like, there's no method of me saying, I hereby, take back my right, and I'm going to I'm going to enforce this on my own terms. You guys tried, swing and a miss. Thanks so much, Congress. You guys did not do great on that. You talk on page 29 about you say groups do not act. What is the importance of understanding that groups do not act, only individuals act?
That's actually one of the biggest misconceptions that I found for people that are outside our space that are that are with a collectivist mentality, is that they say, well, the people have spoken, or the voice of the people, or something like that, is the idea that a group of people have some sort of separate uh, cognition. There's some sort of living entity, or morality that exists within that is separate and distinct from all the individuals, and that's just it's just when we say that a group acts or the people have spoken, it really is just a shortcut. The example that I give. I don't know if I give this in the book. I don't remember, but a flock of birds. A flock of birds does not chirp. Each bird chirps, but you can't. So you might say, oh, that flock of birds is chirping, but it isn't. It's all the individual ones taking action of themselves that's making the sound. And it's the same thing with any kind of group of humans. That if and actually this kind of dovetails into a little conversation I have later on in the book. If you grant these kinds of anthropomorphic ideas to groups, if you give them its own identity and the group can take actions, then what it does is it absolves any individual within that group who may have committed a crime. If you're standing next to somebody in a big crowd and someone else throws a brick through a window, well, you didn't do that. And so, or maybe the other person could say, well, we were just the other group that did it. You can never identify the individual if the group is committing an atrocity.
That's very important. What do you think about how you would tell someone that this really matters to them and their life? The idea that consent is morality. I might say, well, yes, taxation's theft, the regulation is violent domination, the draft is slavery, and war is mass murder. But that's not going to change me and how I act and how I operate. So it's something far-fetched and hard to really care about. What would you say to that mindset?
Yeah, it's I would approach it by saying, think about your own life, and think about somebody doing something to you. Think about someone, just for a lady taking your purse, for a man taking your wallet. Think about the situation where your consent is violated. It's well, I mean, at the very basic level, it's not a happy thought. And so knowing that damage that's done to you when your consent is violated is universal, is the and which is why I assert that morality is objective, because it's based on consent. Even though each of us consent to different things, we all either consent or withhold our consent to every act that's taken against us. And so that fact that everyone consents is universal, which means that it is an objective human, uh, uh, um, it's an objective piece of humanity. So for the person who's putting it off to the outside, I would just say, just think about it, be a little more empathetic, right? Think about it, how you would feel, and that kind of thing is, we talk about it in foreign policy. Think about what Americans would feel if someone else is doing it to us. That kind of reversal, I think, is really instructive.
Yeah, it's sad that, like a thing that you should kind of learn in kindergarten to explain, well, you shouldn't hit this kid because you wouldn't want to be hit, right? It's amazing how we lose that obvious, that obvious empathetic tool. I mean, I just had it the other day where someone's like, well, regulation is there for us to flourish. It's there to, protect us and set parameters so we can flourish. And I said, all right, so from here on out, before you post anything on the internet, just send it to me. I'll tell you whether or not I approve or disapprove it, just to make sure that you can have a space to flourish. And he blocked me. Now, the point is not to change this person's mind. It's to, show everyone else. And it is it almost benefits you to see how people respond to different ways of communicating something, and just to plant seeds in the minds of everyone else. I am so glad that someone sort of, asked me these questions and made me think about these sort of ideas. I think the main reason, or the main way, that looking into, consent, morality, self-ownership has changed me is, if you really understand people own themselves and people own their own time, you realize that you're not automatically entitled to other people's time or property. So anytime you want to spend 1 second with someone or years with someone, you have to say, all right, they don't owe me any of their time. I need to create something of value. I want to be someone fun to be around. And you know what? If they don't like me, maybe I'll change a little, maybe I'll change a lot, depending on whatever reason I have to, or motivation that I have. But when you recognize that other people don't own you and you don't own them, inversely, it totally changes the dynamic, at least for me, the dynamic of relationships, and how you create value for other people. Do you see actual relationships changing once people embrace the philosophy of self-ownership and voluntarism?
I think there's a lot to that. Thinking about even from a basic, business standpoint, I know that people are not required to buy the book. For example, I am so grateful that people are voluntarily giving of their self, of the time and energy that they used to make money, to hand it to me for essentially you're just ideas that I put down on paper. I am so grateful and so appreciative. And so knowing that they're doing it voluntarily, it makes it all the difference. I mean, I had a conversation with my daughter when she was very young. We used to use the little stars to when they do good, you get a star, and when you earn enough stars, you get a reward. And we'd had a conversation. It's like, because if her brother didn't get enough stars, would it be okay for you to give him your stars so that he could get a reward? And she's like, yeah, but what if I made you give him your stars? And you could almost see that look on her face, and she didn't really understand it. She was just, like a 6-year-old, but there's something viscerally wrong with that. And just being able to give, that whole that nonsensical sharing is caring, ideology, that leads into the socialism kind of ideals. Um, it, if you don't have the ability to voluntarily give, or to voluntarily work together, then there's no value in doing something if you're forced to it. So it absolutely makes all the difference, when it comes to interpersonal, when it comes to business, everything.
And you can just look at how different you feel when you've either volunteered at a charity or you've given to charity, and then you have given money to the IRS, given loosely. It's like, oh my God, more genocide in Yemen, versus, oh gosh, seeing that woman smile was worth everything. Um, and then there's the secondary effects of, if people automatically get money, there's less of an incentive to use it efficiently. So they have to create value. Maybe there will be corruption. That's why we need a free market in charity, so we could opt out of funding the corrupt with the state. You just fund corrupt, and there's nothing you could do besides protest, and then them lie to you about the audit that they did. So there's so many different dynamics. What were you going to say?
No, 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 no. That. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can go down a lot. There's lots of rabbit holes that you could go down for sure.
Now, a major obstacle in this is, you can make a lot of great points, but if someone's mind is open this much, it's hard to get through. So, how do you first open people's minds to first accept the idea that consent is the root of morality?
Well, first, I do ask the person in the book, do you believe, what do you think about consent? I mean, consent is primary. Are you the kind of person who does genuinely value consent? Because I think most people do. As a matter of fact, I did some speaking at a local public high school, and the one and even though I'm quite very very upfront about my anarchism position, the people who are there's a public school. Um, they asked me back multiple times because they know that my philosophy is based on peace and consent, and that really resonates, I think, with especially like high school kids and young adults who understand the absolute criticality of respecting consent choices. And so that's where I start. Okay, if you're with me, if you already see the value and the requirement to respect consent choices, let's follow that path down. So that's what I've always felt is the key, is the kind of the pry bar in.
Yeah, people will sort of sometimes scoff at trying to get to the fundamental rights and philosophical aspects of something. They're like, "Well, I care about the consequences in the real world outcomes of certain policies, not this whole rights and all this, made up stuff in your head." To which I say, first of all, they never even do that with themselves historically. They're like, slavery, objectively wrong. Genocide, objectively wrong. This person was bad. This person was on the right side of history. But when it comes till today, the way they analyze policies is, well, what will it do for the unions and how will this affect GDP? First of all, you have no clue because you're lied to by Keynesian economists all day. Second of all, why is that relevant? I mean, like if I made a great, there's so many people whose GDP and productivity would increase if they were enslaved. What does that tell you about the morality of slavery? It just tells you can increase productivity without it being moral and it still being unjustified. Oh, there's people we could, steal from and kidnap, and that would, stimulate economic yada yada yada. Long story short, they apply morality historically, but to the present, they can't analyze anything because of Rachel Maddow feeding them nonsense all day, along with Sean Hannity. It's like you get it from both sides. So, do you have any go-to questions to sort of plant seeds in their mind? So maybe they go, I can't let this guy know that he's outsmarted me. But at the same time, you want to give them something to think about later. Any ideas on that?
Yeah, I really, I think, well, my approach was just, how much do you really believe uh, that's consent is primary? I'm asking the reader this, like, how much, if if I explain this other problem, like let's say stealing from I think one of the examples is, should we steal from a billionaire to save the life of a homeless person? And that's not a ridiculous question, right? That's a daily question that people ask. And if your answer is yes, okay, but how much do you really care about consent? Yeah, and then you can go into the argument as well, did the billionaire actually get their money legitimately, and how would you, distribute that equitably? I do go into that a little bit. But the bottom line is, how much do you care about respecting consent violations? I really try to hit them in the feels as much as possible, because that's I think, and a lot of folks in our space talk about approach, talk about strategy, and the strategies that we've been taking just have not been as successful, I think, as a lot of us have wanted. The fact of the matter is, people live on their feels, they live on their emotion, and so by tapping into that a little bit and saying, okay, are you okay with violating someone's consent to achieve your own personal interest in the world? Well, at least if someone says yes, then I know they're being honest. But they need to at least understand that is what they're doing.
Yeah, one, they have to understand that's what they're doing, because if they're going off feels, well, maybe you want to make them feel a little bad about what they're doing. And then second of all, you go, wow, okay, so it's okay for people to violate your consent. And then you just get back into the conundrum of earlier of no one owns anything, even themselves, if you have the right to steal and enslave virtually everyone. You also have a pretty cool little map that is built within the structure of the book, a way for people to actually get cryptocurrency just by reading the book, how can people get Bitcoin just by reading the book?
Okay, so this was kind of an idea too, because one thing I oppose intellectual property. As far as I'm concerned, the ideas in the book should be free. However, I wanted a reason for folks to actually buy the print copy of the book, and so I had heard on another show the idea of with Bitcoin, you could hide a Bitcoin key in a book and walk it across a border and bring your Bitcoin with you. And so I said, well, why don't I do that with this book? So there's a pattern of words in the book itself, and those those particular words, when entered, I believe it's bitaddress.org. I've got all the instructions online, and I can explain how to get there. If you put the certain pattern of words together in the right order and enter that into a key generator on bitaddress.org, it'll spit out a key, a public and private key combination. And if you enter the right words, you'll get the Bitcoin wallet that I've preloaded. Now, right now, it only has 0.01 Bitcoin. But as we record this, it's about $300, I think, $330 in that range, which isn't zero. It's something. And I'm going to be adding, for every print copy that is sold on my website, consensusmorality.com, I'll kick in another dollar. So it will grow until someone finds it.
So best place to buy the book is where?
Is consentismorality.com. I was able to grab the URL for the name of the book, so I thought that was pretty good.
Excellent. Yes, and of course you'll see that link in the description. Sean, any primary aspects to consent or morality, the philosophy of peace, that I missed or you would like to reiterate for the listeners?
There is before I get too far off the Bitcoin thing, I want to give out a little hint to the pattern, because if you didn't have the hints to the pattern, you'd never find it. So as a thank you to you and to your listeners, I'm going to give away one of the hints, and all the hints have three words. And the hint for your audience is concatenated in order. Concatenated in order. Now that hint doesn't make any sense to you guys. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to go to consentismorality.com, and there will be a link to get all of the rules and information on how to grab that Bitcoin, and links to where the other hints are. But yeah, as far as the book is concerned, it's a short book. It's about 125, 130 pages in that range. I wrote it for the non-libertarian, for the non-anarchist. So I think it's something you can hand to someone in your family who maybe is sympathetic to the ideas, to get some real basic groundwork and to understand the importance of consent.
Sean Leal, thank you for your time, and thank you to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone.
Thank you.